The Old Testament 5. The Flight of Arrow. It was very fortunate for Israel the Hebrews that the king had a son as good as Saul was evil. Jonathan was his name. He was big and strong like his father, but in spirit he was like David. A boy or a girl like that is sure to win. Jonathan did. He started out with only his armor-bearer to fight the Philistines. All these wicked neighbors had swords and spears, and their swords and spears were keen and sharp. Jonathan had the same weapon, but they were not good for anything. How do we know they were not? Because the people who knew how to sharpen the edges of swords and the points of spears all lived with the Philistines. Of course, the Philistines did not allow their smiths to sharpen the swords and spears of their enemies, the Hebrews. So, in the Hebrew camp, wherever there was a sword or a spear, it must have been dull and blunt, not keen and sharp. The Philistines did not do much thinking, or they would have remembered an important thing about Jonathan, Saul's son. In Israel and outside of it, everyone knew that Jonathan was a great archer. An archer is one who knows how to use a bow and an arrow. Jonathan's bow must have been nearly as tall as himself. It was strong and able to send heavy arrows a long distance. And those arrows were cruel weapons, tipped as they sometimes were with poison, or else with something on their points which stung and burned like a hot coal. It was said that Jonathan never missed any object at which he aimed. The Philistines had been frightening the Hebrews dreadfully, so much so that many had left their homes and were hiding in caves and holes in the rocks. Some of the poor Hebrews had been stolen away from their people and made to work in the Philistine camp. How those wicked neighbors of the Israelites must have laughed as they watched King Saul's army on the opposite hill. Not a soldier dared attack the Philistines. How could men do so without swords and spears? The Philistines were so busy laughing at Saul's weak army that they did not see two men climbing up their hill. You and I know who those two men were. The powerful archer Jonathan and his brave armor-bearer. Up and up the two men clambered along the steep side of the hill. The path must have been slippery with loose stones. Jonathan was a good climber, and could use his hands as well as his feet when he scrambled over the rocks. His armor-bearer was close beside him, for if Jonathan was not afraid, he was not going to be. Their bows were slung over their shoulders, and their quivers filled with arrows hung across their backs. Jonathan intended to surprise the Philistines. Often when people are surprised, they are frightened. Jonathan thought the Philistines would be, and they were. But I'm not getting ahead of my story. And it is never wise to be in too great a hurry when one is telling a story. Jehovah can save with a few as easily as he can with many, said Jonathan to his armor-bearer. If God was with them, then they need have no fear. Jonathan and his helper both believed that God was with them, but each wanted a sign. If only something would happen that would show them exactly what they should do. And that something did happen. The Philistines, peering over the rock, saw them coming. With yells and shouts, these wicked neighbors greeted the two men. "Look at those Hebrews coming out of their holes in the rocks to look at us," they screamed. The soldiers jeered at Jonathan and his armor-bearer. What could those two men do without swords or spears? They were very soon to find out what the two archers could do. "Come up to us, and we will show you a thing," shouted the Philistines. With a great leap and a bound, Jonathan landed in the midst of the Philistine camp, his armor-bearer close beside him. The Philistines were so surprised they did not move. Before they could draw their swords, Jonathan's arrows flew thick and fast upon them. If the Philistines ran, those dreadful arrows followed and pinned soldiers after soldier to the ground. The poisoned points and stinging tips never missed their mark. As arrow after arrow whistled through the air, the Philistines must have screamed aloud with pain and fright. Down the hill they ran, with Jonathan and his armor-bearers after them. The Philistines must have been blinded by the stinging of the arrows, for when they did draw their swords, they began to slay one another. Out from the caves and from behind the rocks where they had hidden swarmed the Hebrews. The Hebrew prisoners in the Philistine camp escaped from their captors and followed after Jonathan and his armor-bearer. Flying down the opposite hill came King Saul and his army, all of them anxious to help the brave Jonathan and his noble armor-bearer. God had saved Israel by the flight of an arrow. The Philistines had fled before it. Honeycomb. Soldiers get very hungry. Tramping through the mud, wading across shallow streams, climbing steep hills, and cutting their way through dark forests make them also very tired. Sometimes they must sleep outdoors in pelting rain. All these things together give them little chance to be comfortable. Something to eat is about the only pleasant thing that comes into a soldier's life. The soldier fights better when he has food in his stomach. No one with an empty stomach feels lively. Saul's army didn't. After Jonathan and Saul's army had chased the Philistines away, the men were hungry and tired. How wise it would have been if Saul had given his soldiers a hearty meal. All the men were feeling miserable, no doubt gloomy and discouraged, as hungry people often are. Saul noticed it. If he had had as much sense as Jonathan, his son, he would have had pity on his men and fed them. Instead, he must have been afraid. Saul spent most of his time being afraid of something, that the soldiers would desert him. So he made a cruel and wicked vow. Any man who ate even a morsel of food before night would be put to death. I suppose Saul thought the soldiers were so hungry they would be sure to follow him because they expected something to eat at the close of the battle. So on the tired army march, Jonathan was ahead, but they soon reached him. Jonathan was tired too, and he was dizzy with hunger. He had worked even harder than the other soldiers, for Jonathan and his armor-bearer alone had routed the Philistines. They all entered a deep, cool forest. How grateful the shade must have been after the long march under the hot sun. No doubt they wished to stop and drink at some of the cool, refreshing brooks that hurried through the forest. Suddenly, buzz, buzz, buzz sounded in their ears. What was it? A great swarm of bees. And that meant delicious honey. The exhausted men fainted with hunger, looked around them in the hollows of the tree trunks, and dripping upon the ground was a mass of rich yellow honey. How the men must have smacked their dry lips. Plenty of honey for all of them, and none dared touch it. They were afraid of Saul's cruel vow. Jonathan had not heard his father's vow. He did not know why the half-starved soldiers did not eat the honey which God had provided. Jonathan dipped his staff in the luscious honey and ate some of it. He felt better at once. "Your father has forbidden us to eat," said the soldier. "My father is hurting the army," replied Jonathan. If the men had been given something to eat, then they would have slain more of the Philistines. Jonathan knew that soldiers who have rested and have had some food fight better and win more battles. Night came. It was dark in the forest. Not a sound was to be heard except the twitter of some sleepy bird or the noise of some small animal rustling through the underbrush. "Let us go down and destroy all the Philistines and take all their goods," said Saul. The soldiers agreed, but not one moved. "What hinders us?" asked Saul. "Someone has sinned," he added. All the soldiers must be questioned to find out which one of them had done wrong that day. Not one of them could be blamed for anything. At last Jonathan stood before his father the king. "What have you done?" anxiously inquired Saul. "I have eaten honey," Jonathan replied. Yes, faint and weak, he had eaten the honey and had felt better. He had been sorry for the hungry soldiers and had wanted them to have the food which they deserved. The king had been cruel in his vow. He had wanted them to have the food which they deserved. The king had been cruel in his vow. So Jonathan had told the soldiers. What do you suppose Saul did when he discovered Jonathan was the culprit? Did he say, "This time we will not keep the vow"? Indeed not. In those days and among those people, when a vow was made, it had to be kept. They believed in keeping a promise, although it was a wicked one. "Jonathan must die," declared Saul. The army heard this word. Was every soldier glad that he had escaped and that it was the king's son who was guilty of disobeying Saul's command? "What? Destroy Jonathan?" cried every one of them. "Put to death the brave man who had saved Israel?" I can see that flashing eye of the soldiers. Can see all of them raising their bows and cruel arrows, or poise their slings in readiness to hurl the deadly stones at the first man who dared touch Jonathan. "There shall not one hair of his head fall to the ground, for he hath wrought with God this day," shouted the army in unison. Saul dared not keep his insane vow. Jonathan was saved because the army had seen that God was with the brave archer of Israel. 2 marksmen. Jonathan, the great archer and brave soldier, loved everything that was great. He admired courage in other people. He probably was glad whenever he could praise one of his soldiers for being brave, because he was brave and true. God sent Jonathan a friend. A man like himself, of course. A hero and a coward cannot be friends. Besides, this friend needed Jonathan's help. That is why God sent him to Jonathan. Who do you suppose this friend was? David, the shepherd lad. Jonathan's bow was powerful. So was David's sling. Neither Jonathan's bow nor David's sling ever missed the mark at which they were aimed. Each had a clever eye and a perfect aim. David had gone out alone, without wearing any heavy armor, and had slain a powerful giant with his sling, a giant who made every Hebrew quake with fear. Goliath, the giant, was a Philistine. I have no doubt that he walked up and down before the Hebrew soldiers and shook his fist in their faces. Even Saul the king was afraid of Goliath. When David slew the savage giant Goliath with his sling, all the troublesome Philistines were driven away again. "Who is this lad?" Saul asked the captain of his army. "I do not know," replied the captain. David answered Saul's question himself, for he came to the king's tent as soon as he had slain the giant. He told Saul that he was only a shepherd lad, the youngest son of the old man named Jesse, who lived in Bethlehem. Jonathan was watching as Saul and David talked together. The more he looked at the frank-faced boy, the more he loved him. Could you and I have known what Jonathan was thinking as he watched David, I'm sure it would have been this: "There's a strong spirit, he is brave and true. God must be with him." From that day Jonathan and David were friends. Everyone with the spirit of love in his heart wishes to give. Jonathan did. He admired David's spirit, and how do you think he showed it? In those days people show their respect for another by taking off their upper garments and giving it to the other they loved. David, you know, was only a shepherd. Jonathan was a prince, the son of a king. He took off his robe and put it on David. He gave David his sword, his wonderful bow, and his girdle, which was Jonathan's way of saying, "You are as much a prince as I." King Saul was not like his son Jonathan. What pleased the great archer made the mean and selfish soul of Saul jealous. Saul wanted to love David. He even tried to, so many times, but he was afraid of the shepherd lad, who was also a brave soldier and beloved by all the people. Saul was afraid of losing his kingdom. Samuel had told him that he would lose it. Who the next king would be, no one, even Saul or David, knew. Samuel knew, but he did not tell. Saul was dreadfully frightened, and he watched David win battle after battle with the Philistines. I know he must have said to himself, after every victory, "This David is no doubt the next king." So the king hated the shepherd lad and often tried to kill him. Saul had another of those dreadful, sad spells, and again David sang and played for him. Saul this time was not helped. His heart was so filled with rage and jealousy that he hurled his spear at David. It missed David and struck the wall. Saul was trying to take everything away from David, even his life. But David's wonderful friend Jonathan, the archer of Israel, gave everything he had to David. It made Jonathan sad to see how his father hated David. He was not even jealous when he thought that David might be king instead of himself. The more you know of Jonathan, the better you will love him, and you will be glad that David had this friend to help him when Saul made David's life so unhappy. Warned by an arrow. There were 4 places at Saul's table, and who do you suppose sat at them? First came King Saul, his spear near him, and a golden crown on his head. Beside him was Abner, captain of the king's army, and Jonathan and David were the other 2. Jonathan always carried his bow with him, and surely David must have had his harp. King Saul so often was disturbed by his sad, angry spells that David must have kept the harp near by so that he could soothe him with his sweet music. Such a happy group it must have been. But it was not, because one of the company had an ungoverned, jealous temper. One person can make many people miserable. Saul did. He hated David, but he could not get along without him, and this made him all the angrier. Every servant in King Saul's house had been told to kill David. Poor King Saul! He surely had a sick mind. His strong, powerful body did not help him because the thinker in his head so often went wrong. Once he had been gentle and kind, but now he hated and wanted to kill. It was David, his son's friend, whom he most hated. Why, Jonathan asked his father, "Do you wish to hurt David? You saw him deliver Israel from the giant and the Philistines, and you were glad." Jonathan added, "For a little while Saul was ashamed of himself. Then David won another battle with the wicked Philistines, which again made the king savage. Nothing that David did pleased Saul. David must die, David must die, or I shall lose my kingdom." Saul must have been thinking to himself all the time. "What have I done that your father should hate me?" David asked. Jonathan the archer did not know. He said to David, "Nothing shall harm you, for I will protect you." And Jonathan kept his word. Then David ate at Saul's table. I wonder if he did not wish he were out on the green hills again, watching the gentle sheep and frisky lambs. It surely would have been much safer. The lion and the bear he had met on those lonely hills were not half as terrible as the savage king. As David ate, he must have watched the glistening spear so close to Saul's cruel fingers. That wicked spear which was so often hurled at David. The spear meant death for David. The bow and arrow of the archer, Jonathan, were to bring David life. How? That is what our story is going to tell us. "I shall not eat dinner with you tomorrow," David told Jonathan. I do not feel safe with your father," he added. Dinner time came. Saul, Jonathan, and Abner were there, but David's place was empty. The next day, also, David was absent. Saul was furious. "Where has that lad gone?" he raged. Jonathan said David had gone to see his brothers. Saul did not believe it. He was afraid that Jonathan had helped David to escape. The king spoke terrible words to Jonathan. He called him and his mother evil names. "Why do you make this son of Jesse your friend?" Saul asked. "Don't you know that as long as David lives, you will never be king?" Jonathan did know, but he did not care. He would like to be king, of course. He was the prince and had a right to be king after his father died. But Jonathan loved something better than he loved being king. He loved to do right, and he knew it was not right to kill David. Besides, he loved David and had promised to help him. Jonathan never intended to desert his father, nor was he going to allow Saul to harm his friend. When Saul flew into a rage at dinner because David was absent, Jonathan asked him, "What has David done that he should be put to death?" The furious king answered by seizing his spear and hurling it at Jonathan. It missed him. Saul's spear seemed always to be missing his mark. His rage and jealousy must have been blinding him so that he could not see to throw straight. The archer angrily left the table. For a whole day Jonathan ate nothing. He was so grieved about David. Before that he had not believed Saul intended to kill his friend, but now he knew David was not safe in Saul's house. He was not even safe in the country where Saul lived. Jonathan must warn his friend and help him escape from the savage king. What should Jonathan do? How could he see David and tell him to flee for his life? Not a hard matter for the archer of Israel. His arrows had won battles. They had brought down everything at which they had been aimed. Either it was bird, beast, or wicked Philistine. Now his arrows could carry a message. The next time Jonathan shot them from his bow, it would not be to kill. The next time his arrows whizzed through the air, they would carry a warning to the waiting David. How? David and Jonathan had planned beforehand how it should be done. Saul, even if he had been there watching, would never have suspected what the arrow was saying. David was hiding in a field. In that country it was always very easy to hide. There are so many rocks behind which one can crouch, or caves in which one can crawl. It was morning, the sun shone, and the birds sang. The little lad who trotted by Jonathan's side must have whistled for joy. It was such a beautiful day in which to be happy. But Jonathan's heart was heavy. His arrows today were going to do the saddest work they had ever been asked to do. They were going to send David, the friend he loved, as his own soul, away from him forever. But the archer did not hesitate. He must act quickly for his friend's safety. He paused beside a great rock. No one but Jonathan knew that David was hiding behind that huge rock. Jonathan drew his bow to his shoulder, and an arrow sped over the field. Then another and another, till 3 arrows lay together upon the ground. "Go fetch me the arrows," Jonathan said to the little lad who was with him. As the boy reached the arrows, Jonathan called to him in a loud voice, "Is not the arrow beyond thee? Make speed, haste, stay not." David listened behind the rock, knew what these words meant. They had really been meant for him instead of for the boy. The message the arrows had carried told David that his life was not safe with Saul. The king intended to kill him. He must go. "Take the arrows to the city," Jonathan told the little lad. He went, and Jonathan was alone. Then from his hiding place came David. The 2 friends kissed each other and wept. Jonathan had kept his word and saved his friend. "Go in peace," Jonathan said to David. "Jehovah shall be between me and thee forever." David turned to go. He must leave home, friend and country. His life was spared, but until Saul the king was dead, he was hunted from place to place as a cat hunts a mouse. A friendly enemy. David, the morning Jonathan sent him away, went to Amalek, the priest. The priest was afraid when he saw David, for it was dangerous to be kind to him. Saul said, "David must be killed." Saul intended to murder any person who treated David kindly. But Amalek was a good man, and gave the hungry lad some bread. He did more. He let David have Goliath's great sword. Some people seem to have eyes in the back of their heads and are able to see all around them at once. Saul did. Not real eyes, of course, but something that served him just as well as the second pair of eyes. Suppose we call Saul's chief herdsman Doeg. A pair of eyes for Saul. This wicked man's eyes watched David and the priest. Did he have pity for them? Not a bit. Off Doeg hurried to tell the savage king. Poor David, no place was safe for him. When he went into the desert, Saul crossed the hot sands after him. If he sought shelter in the cool forest, he soon heard the tramp of Saul's soldiers and knew he must find another place where he could hide. There were other men besides David who had to run away from the king. All these men banded together and chose David as their leader. He must have been happier when he had companions. David and his men hid in dark, damp caves. Those gloomy places were often filled with darting bats, gliding snakes, and ugly spiders. When they fled to the desert, they would find little to eat. They might have been fortunate enough to find ostrich eggs hidden in the sand. Night-time in the forest was not more pleasant. Hooting owls and barking foxes and yelping jackals must have disturbed the men. Bears were in the mountains and wolves were on the plain, but David and his men knew it was safer to live with the wild beasts than to be near savage King Saul. Saul, all out of breath from hunting David for so long, sat down under a tree to rest. He was angry with his servants and his soldiers. He told them they were not sorry for him, that they were helping David to escape. "My son Jonathan has joined hands with David, and now both are against me," complained the king. Up spoke Doeg, the herdsman, the wicked fellow who watched David and the priest. Then this miserable creature, who was Saul's second pair of eyes, told the king about David's visit with Amalek's kindness. I wonder that this word did not choke him. "Send for Amalek," cried Saul. Amalek came, and many other priests came with him. "Kill every priest," commanded the king. But the soldiers did not raise a bow to their shoulders, nor put a stone in their sling. The soldiers respected the priests, and would not touch them. The furious king then shouted to Doeg, "Turn thou, and fall upon the priests." Worse than the wild beast was this savage Doeg. He drew his sword and slaughtered all the priests. This terrible man did another awful thing. He went to the priest's city and killed everyone in it except Abiathar, one of Amalek's sons. Men, women, little children, all were killed. Not an ox, a donkey, or a sheep was left alive. Then Jonathan came to see David. He wanted to keep the shepherd lad from being discovered. "Don't be afraid of my father. My father will never be able to find you," said Jonathan. He knew his father was a bad king, and that David would make a good king. Israel ought to have a good king. So Jonathan told David that some day he would be king. Samuel had known all the time that David would be king, but he had told no one. "You have promised to be kind to my children when you are king," added Jonathan. Then back to his house went the faithful friend, and David turned into the wilderness. David and his men were asleep in their cave. Something startled them, and they awoke. They saw Saul alone, groping his way into the dismal cave. The king sat down to rest. "Now is your chance," whispered David's men. "Your enemy is here in your power. Kill him." David reached forth his hand, but drew it back. "I cannot kill him. God has anointed him king," David answered. He crept softly behind Saul and cut off the skirt of his long robe. Soon Saul left the cave with David following him. When the king was at a safe distance, David called to him and said, "See the skirt of your robe, which I have cut. You were in my power, and I did not kill you. God will deliver me out of your hand." Saul was ashamed for a moment. He was sorry he had been so wicked. "God will reward you because you have not killed me," Saul said to David. Then he cried out, "I know well that thou shalt surely be king." Saul asked David not to destroy his family. David promised. The king went back to his camp. David and his men left the cave. They might be farther away from Saul. The mad king could not be trusted. Song of the Bow. Saul's old enemy, the Philistines, were wide awake. They were all improving every minute of their time, getting ready to march into the Hebrews' country and steal it away from them. The Philistines were envious of the Israelites because they wanted their rich country. What was Saul doing? Wasting his time hunting David until he drove the brave captain and his men out of the country. The Philistines were afraid of David because he always whipped them whenever they ventured into the land of Israel, and sent them running back into their own country. David had gone. Samuel was dead, and Jonathan's arm must have grown weak. His grief over his friend and Saul's savage temper must have made it so. Now is our time to invade the Israelites' country, the Philistines must have said, and into it marched the Philistine army. Saul saw it coming, and his knees knocked together with fright. The long lines of glistening spears, the powerful archers with their great bows, the prancing horses and heavy chariots of the Philistines made Saul's heart sick with fear. He looked at his own miserable little army. What could his handful of soldiers do against the thousands of mighty warriors camped beside him in the valley? King Saul had no horses nor chariots. His swords and his spears were dull. What was worse than all, the king, his soldiers, and all his people were dreadfully frightened. I think all of them must have been thinking more of where they could hide than how they could fight. King Saul needed help. Where would he get it? He had killed the priests and driven away the prophets. He tried to pray. He must have forgotten how, because God Jehovah did not answer him. Something must be done, and at once, for tomorrow was to be the great battle with the Philistines. The king's servants told him there was a witch in Endor. "Let us visit her tonight. Perhaps she can help you," some of them suggested. Saul and 2 of his men went to talk with this witch. This showed that he had forgotten God. A black night hid their journey from Gilboa, Saul's camp, to the witch's cave in Endor. Saul and his 2 men hurried along the path. It was many miles to Endor, and the road was rough and stony and full of holes, but they traveled along it in the dark until they reached the witch's home. They must have ridden on donkeys, for those little animals can find their way in the dark. King Saul had tried to drive every witch and wizard out of his kingdom. Perhaps they may have kept telling the people that David was going to be king. Only the old woman in Endor was left, and she had bad news for him. "Call Samuel for me," Saul said to the woman. "I see an old man covered with a robe," she replied. All was still. The fluttering of the leaves and the croaking of the frogs must have hushed as Saul cried, "It is Samuel!" "Why do you call upon me?" inquired Samuel. "God has departed from me," Saul replied. "I have no power to help you, if God has departed from you," Samuel replied. Saul could not answer. He could only listen as Samuel uttered the terrible words that told the king his punishment was near at hand. "You have lost your kingdom, and it will be given to David," Samuel said. And he added, "The Philistines will conquer Israel, and tomorrow you and your son will die on the battlefield." King Saul fell upon the ground. All his mighty strength left him. The witch tried to comfort him and coax him and his men to eat. Then out into the night they went back to Gilboa. With the morning came the battle. The frightened Hebrews ran wildly in every direction. Arrows whizzed through the air. Swords flashed and chariot wheels ground under them and the bodies of the Hebrew soldiers. Jonathan lay dead upon the hill. The great archer of Israel had fallen before the archers of the Philistines. Jonathan's 2 brothers lay dead beside him. The wounded king leaned heavily upon his sword. "Kill me before the Philistines take me prisoner," Saul begged his armor-bearer. The young man dared not obey, for he was afraid to harm the king. Saul flashed his sword in the air, fell upon it, and its blade pierced through his body. The armor-bearer then fell upon his sword, and king and squire died together. A courier from the battlefield brought David the news. David mourned, he and his men. All day they wept and fasted. In a song David told the love he had for Jonathan. Every child in Judah was taught this song and the use of the bow. David did not wish his faithful friend forgotten, so he made it a rule that the children should remember the great archer by learning archery. Here is the song which David sang about Jonathan. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back. How were the mighty fallen in the midst of the battle? O Jonathan is slain upon thy high places. I am distressed for thee, my brother, Jonathan. Very pleasant hast thou been unto me. Thy love to me was wonderful, passing the love of a woman. King Saul was dead. He could no longer trouble David, nor drive him and his brave soldiers from their homes. I should like to have been in the city of Hebron when David and his big family returned. It was a happy return for David because his clansmen, the men of Judah, anointed him their king. But Judah was only a small part of Israel. The biggest part of it belonged to Ishbosheth, Saul's son. Ishbosheth wanted every bit of the country. He was greedy like his father, but David did not care. If Saul's family wanted to reign over part of Hebrew land, he was willing they should. But Joab, the general of David's army, and Abner, Saul's old general, wanted to quarrel. Joab thought David ought to be king and have everything, while Abner was determined Ishbosheth should reign. So David's brave men and Saul's old soldiers kept fighting nearly all the time. In every battle David's men won. The Philistines were watching and thought it would be easy for them to trouble Israel again. Being king did not seem to give David any rest. Now, of course, he did not have to keep running away and hiding all the time from savage Saul, but he did have to keep fighting with Abner, Saul's general. Besides, he had to send his soldiers many, many times to drive the Philistines out of the country. This was discouraging work, for just as soon as those troublesome neighbors were driven out of one place, they came in at another. The Philistines, always doing dreadful things, had nailed Saul's and Jonathan's bodies to a well. They were not going to allow the king and Prince Jonathan to be buried. You remember the people Saul once saved from having their right eyes put out? These people were grateful. When all was still at night, they stole to the wall and took down the bodies. Saul and his sons were buried by these brave men. This act pleased David. He promised always to be kind to these men because they had treated their dead king and dead prince kindly. Very different was the fate of the soldier who stole Saul's bracelet and golden crown after Saul had fallen upon his sword. So anxious was this soldier to tell David what he thought would be good news that he ran all the way from the battlefield to David's home. He was so sure King David would rejoice over Saul's death that he told a falsehood. He said he himself had killed Saul. He must have expected a fine present from David, or perhaps some money for bringing him the news. Instead, he was greatly disappointed, for David had him punished. To kill a king was a crime in David's eyes. David really was kind-hearted. He wanted to please God. Pleasing God is doing everything as it ought to be done, and that is what David wished to do. But he had a hard time doing it. Many of his people, his soldiers, and even some of his generals, Joab, intended to have their own way, whether it was right or wrong. Do you know any girl or boy like that? Ishbosheth, thankless, like Saul, his father, made his good friend Abner and his father's general very angry. Instead of praising Abner for helping him to be king, Ishbosheth found fault with him. There is no one trying to help Saul's family, Abner must have said, except Jonathan. They are all greedy and selfish. Ishbosheth was dreadfully frightened when Abner said he was helping him and now was going to let David have the kingdom. Jehovah hath sworn to David that he shall be king, and I am not going to fight for you any longer, Abner told him. Off rushed some messengers from Abner to David. I am on your side now, Abner wrote to David. If you will be friendly with me, I will make all Israel ask you to be their king. Abner kept his word with David. He saw now that Saul's sons were not the right kind of men to make good kings. The elders of Israel were glad to have a new king, one whom they could trust. So when Abner said to them, In times past you sought for David to be king over you. Now then do it. They made David king. Then David made a great feast for Abner. He liked Saul's old general. You remember about the 4 places at Saul's table where Saul, Jonathan, Abner, and David sat? I think David and Abner must always have been good friends. Each was brave and strong, and neither one did small, mean things. Abner was open and honest, not false and treacherous like Joab. David promised Abner that he had all his staff should be safe when they visited Hebron. It was a happy feast. Everyone was satisfied. For a long time, all the people had really wanted David for their king. Joab was not present at the feast. He was not in the city when Abner came, nor when he and his men left for their homes. Then there happened so wicked and terrible a thing that Joab almost lost his place as David's general. David had promised safety to Abner. Joab was angry. He did not care what David had promised. Joab went after Abner, called him back to Hebron, pretended to be his friend, and while they were talking together, Joab stabbed Abner until he died. What did King David do? He mourned for Abner and went in great funeral procession to his grave. David sang a song about Abner as he had about Jonathan. All Israel saw that it was Joab's wicked, jealous temper that had made him kill Abner. David was not to blame. Another thing made David sad. Some bad men wanted What did King David do? He mourned for Abner. What did King David do? He mourned for Abner and went in great funeral processions to his grave. David sang a song about Abner as he had about Jonathan. All Israel saw it was Jacob's wicked, jealous temper that had made him kill Abner. David was not to blame. Another thing made David sad. Some bad men wondered why David did not kill Ishbosheth. They kept thinking about it until they themselves decided to kill him. At noonday, Ishbosheth lay on his bed asleep. He was trying to rest from the dreadful heat. While Ashbosheth slept, these wicked men killed him and hurried to David to tell them of their deed. David was horrified. "Wickedly murdering a man when he was helpless and asleep?" exclaimed David. "You deserve to die yourselves." He added, so David ordered them to be put to death. Then came all the tribes of Israel to David, saying, "In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was thou that leadest out and brought in Israel, and Jehovah said to thee, Thou shalt be prince over Israel." So all the elders came to Hebron and anointed David their king. From all over the country the people traveled to be honoring David. 3 times had he been anointed king. That is, he was anointed of God. He surely must have deserved his kingdom. Saul, the judge of Israel, had seen that David was God's choice. The men of Judah also saw it. At last all Israel knew that God was with David, and they also anointed him their king. From far away and from homes close by, people flocked to Hebron. There must have been music and dancing and singing, and feasting was much like ours on Thanksgiving Day. Tramp, tramp, tramp came the soldiers of Israel. Shining shields and glistening spears and flashing swords shone through in the sunshine as the armies crossed the swift Jordan and mounted the hills towards Hebron. The archers of Benjamin followed with their great bows and arrows. Long caravans of happy people brought David presents. Camels, donkeys were laden with bread. Oxen and mules carried meal, fig cakes, raisins, oils, and wine. Cattle and sheep the people brought with them. For at this anointing feast they must have plenty of meat. David was king, chosen by his people because he had first been chosen by God.